Hey everyone, my name is Connor Burr. I'm a TA for this class. I'll be giving a lecture on classical conditioning today. So you might be wondering, what is classical conditioning? So classical conditioning is the learned association between two previously unrelated things through repeated pairing. And that'll make sense in a little bit. It's a lot of words. Another word you may have heard is operant conditioning, and that's more of a reward and punishment. That'll be a different lecture. So most famous experiment and the first really experiment known for classical conditioning is Pavlov's dogs. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist who's known as the founder of classical conditioning. For his experiment, he had some dogs, and every time he went to feed them, he rang a bell. Soon enough, he began to notice that as soon as he rang that bell, the dogs would start to salivate in anticipation for that food. And in classical conditioning, there are four major things you need to know. You have the unconditioned stimulus, which in this case would be the food. You have the unconditioned response, which is them salivating. You then have the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell ringing, and the conditioned response, which is them salivating. So we can move on to another example, which is from The Office.
I have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? Dwight, want an Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. What are you doing? What? I don't know. My mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden. I have to reboot.
Okay, so if you'll notice in that video clip from The Office, the unconditioned stimulus was, would you like an Altoid? That's what Jim asked. And then his unconditioned response, Dwight's, would be to hold out his hand for the Altoid. And the neutral stimulus is the computer sound. It's also the conditioned stimulus. So it has nothing to do with an Altoid or holding out your hand. But as he continued to pair the computer sound with asking about an Altoid, when he made that computer sound that last time, Dwight held out his hand for the Altoid, even though he wasn't asked the question. So it's a really good example of classical conditioning in use. Some other examples of classical conditioning in our lives is like celebrities in advertising, such as like Jennifer Garner was in almost every Capital One commercial that I remember. And if you like Jennifer Garner, they're hoping that you're more likely to get Capital One card because of those feelings towards Jennifer Garner. So if you like her movies or something like that, that'll carry over because of classical conditioning to something that she really has nothing to do with, but she's a part of their advertising. Another example is food poisoning. If you're eating a food and you get sick, you no longer really want to eat that food. My mom, she went to Nations one time. It's a burger place. She ate some food there, then got really bad food poisoning, and she hasn't really been back since. She refuses to go, and so that's another example of classical conditioning. You can also use it to combat drug cravings, which is really interesting. Another example that we talked about in some previous lectures is enuresis, which is involuntary bedwetting by children who are old enough to have control over it. And the treatment for it is that you have underwear that when it senses moisture, it rings a bell to wake up the parents. So after a few times of this happening, the parents will wake up the kid and rush them to the bathroom. So having a full bladder gets paired with waking up. So that's how they can solve enuresis. And you see this done a lot, actually. Moving on to another famous experiment, you have John Watson, who's the experimenter, and little Albert. So little Albert was a 9-month-old, and they brought in a little white rat. And as 9-month-old, not scared of rats. I might be, but that's a different story. And brought in the little rat, and he went to reach for it, and he'd bang on a thing really loud right behind him. And so little Albert would start to cry. So after a few times of reaching and then the bang, little Albert got to the point where every time he saw the white rat, he'd start to burst into tears, because he was worried that the loud noise was coming. And so the unconditioned stimulus for this would be the loud noise, and the unconditioned response is bursting into tears. The conditioned stimulus is the white rat, and the conditioned response was bursting into tears. And you might be wondering why I have a picture of a white rabbit here as well. So just 5 days later, little Albert generalized this reaction to when presented with any white fluffy thing such as rabbits, he'd start to burst into tears. And there are a lot of ethical issues with this experiment, because little Albert developed a very large fear on something that he previously hadn't had. And typically you don't want to give people more fears, you want to take those away. So that is an issue with this experiment. Moving on to kind of how classical conditioning works. And so there are 5 steps or kind of stages for classical conditioning. The first one is acquisition. And so acquisition is the initial learning of the response. And so you might be wondering, like, how much time should be between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So the bell ringing and the food. And typically it's about half a second, but it can vary. But you need to make sure that the neutral stimulus must come before the unconditioned stimulus. So ring the bell before presenting the food. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's not going to do anything. You're not conditioning anything. And the number of trials that it takes for acquisition to occur varies depending on what is learned. So there's not like a set like 5 or something like that. It could be 5, it could be 7, it could be 15. You never really know. They do know that something like teaching a dog to fear the sound of a rattlesnake, something that is important for safety and might already be like coded, does typically happen faster. Acquisition happens faster in that situation. Next, we have extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction is the diminished response that occurs when the conditioned stimulus or the bell ringing no longer signals an impending unconditioned stimulus or the food. So if you keep ringing the bell, but there's no food, over time the salivation will start to go away. But you have spontaneous recovery, which is the reappearance of a weakened conditioned response after a pause. So if you bring back the food with the bell, then the salivation will come back usually pretty quickly, hence the spontaneous recovery part. And so moving on to generalization, talked about this with little Albert, with the rabbits or similar white fluffy objects that even happen to like just a fur coat or something. And generalization is responding to stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. So anything similar, so like Pavlov dogs, started salivating to slightly different tones. That would also be generalization. And we do this as kids with all kinds of things. With dogs, we have an idea of what a dog is, and we can generalize that. Trees, birds, all this kind of stuff, we generalize to make sense of it. So that's generalization for you. Then finally, we have discrimination. And discrimination is how to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus, which predicts the unconditioned stimulus, and other irrelevant stimuli. So Pavlov's dogs were actually taught to respond to a particular tone instead of all tones. How this was done is when there was a particular tone, that is when they would bring the food. And if it was any other tone, they wouldn't bring the food. So the dog started to salivate at just one particular tone instead of all tones, kind of like on that spectrum. So that's also really interesting. And just to kind of summarize a little bit of what we've learned. So classical conditioning is the learned association between two previously things through repeated pairing. The two most famous experiments were done by Ivan Pavlov and John Watson. And the 5 parts for classical conditioning are acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. Thanks and have a great day.